Hi everyone, I'm Nikia Nolan, Livestock Officer for the North Coast Local Land Services. Behind me here is a paddock that I'd like to move some cattle into today, so let's go through a paddock check on what to look for before you move your cattle into their new paddock. When doing a paddock check, it's always good to walk into the paddock to get a good feel and look over the uniformity or changes within the paddock, rather than just having a look from the gate or from the fence. You can't expect pastures throughout a paddock to always be uniform. There will be changes in plant density and quality. Plant composition, biomass, and quality will always be changing throughout the paddock. This is due to stock camps, laneways, fence lines, gateways, areas where water may be sitting, different soil types and soil characteristics, and also areas where you may have been previously feeding out different feeds such as hay or silage, or where your vehicles may be travelling across the paddock. As you can see in this paddock, the plants are well past the 3-leaf stage. Our goal here before grazing this paddock was to have full canopy closure. From the gate, it looks like there is full canopy closure of this pasture, but as you walk through it, there are still areas where the pasture hasn't quite recovered. We have had a pretty tough winter here, and that's why we've waited a little bit extra before grazing this paddock. Because of this, you can see that some of the pastures are starting to boot and flower, therefore getting seed heads. This does reduce the quality a bit, but at least we know there will be enough herbage mass here to fill the cattle. This here is an improved pasture. There is quite an array of different species within this pasture. We have ryegrass, oats, chicory, plantain, and clovers all together in this mix. These improved pastures offer higher quality feed for our productive goals of gaining weight on our steers. If this feed was very stalky from going to seed head and wasn't as vegetative, there may be a need to supplement with, say, a urea block. If your cattle are grazing this pasture and don't seem to be performing as good as you were hoping for, it may be best to get a feed test to see the quality of this feed in case there may be an underlying nutrient deficiency. For that, you may need to be supplementing. To address any issues with withholding period or grazing risks, it's always good to know the history of your paddock. This paddock has not had any recent chemical or fertilizer use, therefore it should be safe to graze. Let's go have a look around to see if there's any weeds or plant species that may be a risk to grazing. So let's define what a weed is. A weed is any plant growing where it's not meant to grow. Here I've spotted a plant which we haven't planted in this paddock recently. However, to me, it looks like it could still be beneficial in this pasture sward. So let's ID it. It's always best to ID a plant when it's in its reproductive phase, because when it's vegetative, it's sometimes difficult to distinguish between different leaves. When the plant's reproductive, you can see its flower head or seed head. These are very distinctive to each plant. Looking at this plant, I think it is prairie grass, which isn't as productive as other pasture species in a pasture sward. As we recently purchased this farm about 12 months ago, the previous owner must have planted this species in the pasture sward as it is a good complementary species to ryegrasses over winter. Even though I wasn't sure on the ID of this plant, I don't classify it as a weed because I think it's still beneficial in this pasture sward for grazing. Let's go for a walk and see if there's any other plants that we can ID to see if they're weedy or not. Here is what I would call a pasture species in this paddock. This here is dock. You can tell by the flower head with the colouring of being a bit greeny reddy colour, and the leaves, which are sometimes similar to chicory or plantain, however they've got this reddish marking and sometimes get a bit curly. This dock has popped up in this pasture after the high rainfall events we had about a year ago. Dock isn't as palatable as the other grass species in this paddock, so I'm not worried about stock consuming it. This weed is not considered toxic to livestock as it's not as palatable, so they won't eat large amounts of it. However, if it is consumed in extreme quantities, they may cause oxalate poisoning in stock. As there's plenty of other feed available, of good quality in this paddock, I would not say this stock is a grazing risk to the livestock entering this paddock. Let's see if there's anything else we can check out. So I've noticed a few of these patches of taller yellow flowered plants popping up in this pasture, especially where the density isn't as thick and competitive. I have plenty of weed books at home, which I always love to carry around with me when I'm not sure on identifying species. I'm going to pull out a smaller plant from this patch so we can look at some characteristics and ID it. When IDing plants which have flowers, it's always good to note the colour of the flower and what the flower looks like. This plant has pale yellow flowers of about 4 petals and has some darker veins within the petal. Looking more at this plant, as I pulled it out, I could really tell that it's quite hairy and bristly, nearly spiky. The leaves of it look similar to chicory, dock or plantain, and when I look at some of the really small species around it, it's nearly like a rosette before it stalks up. The seed pod on this plant is quite distinctive and might help with IDing it. Looking at the root system, these roots are not fibrous. There's quite a distinctive tap root there, which made it a little bit hard to pull out. Closer to the base, it's a bit woody and purpley colour. That might help in IDing it. I'm going to pop this plant down now and have a look through the book to see if this relates to any ID. Looking through this book, I'm sure this weed is wild radish. It's distinctive from the pale yellow flowers with 4 petals which have dark veins. It also has that long pointy seed pod like we talked about and the bristly wiry hairs around the stems. It says here that the younger plants start off as a rosette and then get weedy like this here. This isn't toxic to stock, not as palatable, so they shouldn't be eating it. However, it can taint milk and meat if they do graze this. After IDing this plant and understanding the characteristics and life cycle, I think the best strategy will be to graze this paddock and then come back and either slash this down or spot spray it with a selective herbicide. That way we can encourage the competition of the more desirable pasture species. Looking around this paddock, I can't see much else unusual. However, I have spotted some type of thistle over there, so let's check it out as the final weed. This here is a spear thistle. Dark green in colour, can get up to 1.5 metres tall when mature, and has a bright purple flower. This one here hasn't flowered yet, however it's pretty close with these little buds. For that, it's a great time to graze this paddock, remove the cattle and slash before this becomes reproductive. This isn't much of a grazing worry as it's not palatable to cattle due to all the spikes, except for when paddocks are heavily infestated by them. It may cause some eye injuries to cattle. There's not many in this paddock, so it won't be too much of a worry laying the cattle in to graze. When I walk through a paddock, I always like to pick up bits of grass as if I'm a cow myself getting a mouthful. Cattle eat using their tongue. That way, when you grab it like this and pull, it's good representation of what they're getting in one mouthful. Here you can see they're getting a few stems, but they're mostly selecting a few leaves and the odd maybe seed head. I'm pretty happy with what I'm grabbing hold of here. They'll be getting a fair few leaves, but still a bit of fibre, so that the food may not be going right through them. When people talk about soft palatable grass species, they're generally referring to grass that when you pick it up, you're able to easily break it up and it's soft and gentle to the touch. That means it's palatable for the cattle. When you pull it and squish it and roll it in your fingers, if you get a bit of moisture, it's usually 30 or less % dry matter. That means it's mostly water and it's generally good digestibility. If you were to pick up grass that was hard to the touch, a bit bladey and sharp on your fingers, that's generally referred to as a harder grass. That's because it's not as palatable or desirable to the cattle. Sharper bladey grass can cause injury and cut the tongue. Therefore, cattle learn that they don't want to eat that and will go searching for other softer grasses. I've gone along and I've picked some seed heads. If your pasture is in a reproductive phase, it's not going to be as good a quality. As you can see, it's much harder to break up. That's because it's full of fibre, it's not as soft to the touch, and so it's going to be a lot less digestible when the cattle are eating it. Also, when you roll it up and squish it, there's not as much moisture coming out of this grass. That's because reproductive grasses are a lot less quality even though there may be more herbage mass. There's always a trade-off. The digestibility of reproductive grasses isn't as high as when the grass is vegetative and full of moisture. Now that we've had a look at the pastures and weeds and we know that the pasture is ready for the cattle to come in and graze safely, we'll do the last few things on our paddock checklist. I've just checked this water trough behind me and know it's good quality and there'll be enough water for all the cattle as it's being pumped by a solar pump, which is currently working. I will still check the water each day to make sure it's good quality and enough quantity there for the cattle in this paddock. Lastly, we'll also go around, look at the perimeter of the paddock, make sure the fences are good and safe to keep the cattle in, and we'll check out the shade, make sure there's enough shade for all the cattle in this paddock, and we'll also make sure there's no rubbish such as plastic or wire that may injure or be mistakenly eaten by the cattle. Let's go do these last few things now. Now that we've gone through this paddock check and this paddock's ready for all the cattle to move into, let's have a look at the other paddock that we've just moved them off to see why we've moved them. Here we're in the paddock where the cattle have just moved out of. So as you can see, we are aiming to maintain 100% or close to that for ground cover. So here you can pretty much not see any soil. There is good enough residue that the grass is able to respond quickly after grazing. If you graze it too low, you'll get past the growth point of the grass and it won't be able to recover as quick or it may become dormant. As you look across this paddock, you can definitely see the selective grazing behaviour of cattle. Steers, which came out of this paddock, are a lot more selective and picky than older cows. This is because they love this palatable, fresh pick of sweet kikuyu grass, vegetative ryegrass and clovers over some of this more stalky, grassy seed heads and the older, less palatable plantain and chicory. As a good grazing strategy, you may follow these mobber steers along with a herd of cows which will be happy to pick up all of this excess biomass. Or you may come along with a slasher to cut down this grass evenly to enable even competition between grasses so that more palatable grasses don't get outcompeted and weeds such as dock won't come in. Now that we've done a paddock check, everything looks good. Let's go get the cattle and put them into their new paddock. Whenever I move cattle, I find it a good opportunity to get a head count to make sure everyone's there. And also, when you move them into their new paddock, I always like to make sure they know exactly where the water is, they're settled, and their heads are down grazing.